In the previous video, we looked at the is keyword and how that can help you identify null values. Now, that goes into being defensive. When you are working with null values, it is extremely important that you are aware that you are working with null values. And so we talked about cleaning up your data, replacing those null values with sane values. And so how would we go about that? Well, we would do something called null value substitution. It is the ability to replace null values to operate on the data. You basically are making the null not a null value in this case. You're replacing it with something else, you're substituting it. And so there is a keyword called coalesce, which allows us to do this. When you do select coalesce column name and you give it a fallback value, what you are basically saying here is coalesce this column that may or may not have null values. And when it is null, replace that null with empty. And because we are running a function against a column, you all remember that we have to alias the column name if we don't want it to be named after the function that was executed upon it, because when you execute a function on a column, it loses its column name because you are now ostensibly changing that data. And so what's important to note here is that when we coalesce returns the first non-null value in the list. So if it's null, we'll replace it. But if it's not null, we'll replace it with the value we found. What do you mean, Mo? We only saw one value go in there. You put the column name as the first parameter and the fallback as the second parameter. Well, that's what's special about coalesce. You can give it multiple columns to fall back on. So if you had, let's say, a table that had multiple columns that may or may not contain data, what you could do is you could coalesce against each column and then have a fallback. What that means is that the column 1 is the first one it's going to check. If it doesn't have a null value, then that's the one we're returning. Okay, it has a null value, so we'll fall through. We'll go look at column 2. Does that have a null value? Oh no. Okay, then we'll take that. But if it does, let's fall through to column 3. Does that have a null value? Yes, no. And so it's like this if-else case. If this is null, else go look at column 2. Else go look at column 3. Else return our default. And so you're combining the coalesce against columns. This allows you to create a more complex fall through of null value substitution. And so let's go take a look at that. So over here, we are in dbfiddle. And here is our table again with some data from students that contain null values. So let's select star from student and let's look at it. Well, what we can see here is that student 1 has a name and no last name. Student 2 has the same thing going on. Student 1 also has no age. Student 3 has no first name. Student 4 has no first and last name. And student 5 has no last name. Okay, so how would coalesce work here? Well, let's say you wanted to select all of the students by name. Well, let's say we did name and we did last name for good measure. So let's run that. Well, what we can see here is that student 1 has null, student 2 has null, student 3 has a last name, student 4 has no first and last name. So let's go ahead and let's coalesce the first names. So let's run coalesce and let's say, well, you take name or you say no name available. And let's see what that does. So let's expand this out. So the column name was renamed to coalesce. Interesting, like we said would happen. And if there is a null value, we are replacing it with no name available. So coalesce allows us to substitute the null values. Awesome. What if we wanted to run a sum against the ages? Well, let's go look at that because we clearly have ages available. So if we set sum age, well, the value of sum will most likely take nulls into account. But let's run it. 137. Well, let's look at that. Let's go look at age as an individual attribute, and let's go check if that's right. 25 plus 20, 45, plus 34 plus 58. That seems to be correct. So it took the null value into account. But let's say we did sum of age. But let's say we did something special and we coalesced the null values. And we said, well, if it isn't an age, let's return 20. Will this work? Let's take a look. And I see here it's coalesce. So we're coalescing against a fallback number. Let's see if this works. 157. So what if I make this 200? We are falling back on age and we are giving it a default value. So let's say we got into a scenario where we had a database and a table where we had null values and we had an approximation of what the price should be. Well, then we could just give it a fallback value against the sum. And we could coalesce those null values to be rounded up to the nearest. There are many scenarios in which you will want to coalesce null values to give it some kind of variation. For instance, if you were in a classroom and you knew that the general age of the population in the class was 13 because it is a certain grade, you could coalesce the null values to be 13 in this case. The nuances of this approach vary depending on the scenario you are in. You may or may not want to use coalesce. But the thing is, always try to use it when dealing with null values to give it a sane fallback. Because if you're doing complex calculations, sure, in this case, sum took it into account, but some analytical functions may not handle null values as well. All right, so let's get into some exercises.